Hi class, welcome to Module 2. As we begin the second week, and for those of you that are working early on this, you will find that social class and poverty reign throughout all of sociology as we look at the differences between social classes and the social inequality that occurs in the United States and in other countries as we explore this concept. So identifying social class here as well as other places is part of this process in this chapter. There's probably no other greater area. Your chapter explores a number of things here, including the difference between relative and absolute poverty. And how it comes into effect. And we look at the issues that come into place. You'll see that I talk about a little bit here what we do in the classroom, and you'll see some of that in the videos that will be posted from the classroom. But I asked the class to contribute on the second week of class and pass the hat around the room and send them to the bookstore to buy food. Now, as we well know, the bookstore at Mansfield University, for those that are on campus on occasion, doesn't have a great deal to feed anybody. But there is a clear division of what you can afford and what you can't afford. In an average class, I may get $10, and therefore those in the upper class get 50% of that, basically $5 to go spend. And the poorest of the poor get about 40 cents. It's important as we look at what differences it makes in a person's life and how they affect. So let's pop over to the PowerPoints and let me get the right one up here for you. If my computer will work with me, and we'll bring that up and start exploring some of those issues. So what's social stratification? And what's involved in it? And why does social stratification equal social inequality? Well, social stratification talks about those characteristics that serve as social boundaries, what puts us into place: age, race, ethnicity, gender, social, sexual orientation, and physical abilities. Now, you'll notice that this already is starting to cover some of the topics of our chapters. Do you see already that age is a chapter and race is a chapter? Race and ethnicity are a chapter, and gender is a chapter, and I add physical abilities under medical for us to look at. And then there's sexual orientation, which is a chapter. All of these play into the social stratification. And then there's those big pieces: our experience in life, our marital status, our income, our work, our background, our religious beliefs. All of these stratify us and put us in place in society. So let's look at income stratification. A fifth, the top fifth of the country earn about 51% of the income. And we're talking income here. This isn't even resources that they already own, but they get 51% of the income that comes into place. The second fifth, which would basically be the upper middle class, gets about 23%. The middle class here, as we're looking at it, gets about 14%, and the fifth, the fifth, that should be the fourth fifth there. Our chapter, our PowerPoints are incorrect. Let's see if I can even go in and adjust that. Right, the fourth fifth gets into place about 8% of the income, and the lowest gets about 3.2%. So $10, 32 cents as those students go on. It's pretty significant. Well, we always know in the United States, if you work hard, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can get out of that level of poverty, right? Well, not necessarily, right? That there's a significant value that's put in place that defines us who we are based on our social status. And it puts us into this prospect of can we do better? Now, wealth is usually defined as the assets that a household owns. It's the house, it's the savings, it's everything. It's way beyond those income statistics that we just looked at, and whether we are enhancing one's lifetime. Wealth is a measure of gross assets and net worth. So, important to start thinking about that as we're exploring the population today. We know that this is an ever-changing thing, that in the past you went to college, you earned more money, and therefore you became wealthier. Today, because of the high debt level that comes into place, it affects things, doesn't it? And that social inequality can remain. So what does it mean to be poor? Well, college students, we're there. And it's pretty significant, isn't it? And I can remember only two pairs of shoes when I was in college, and one of them had holes in the bottom, and my roommates threw them out because they had holes in them, and they were my only other pair of shoes. They were my dress shoes that I put on, and all I had was one pair. We've lived by basic necessities getting by, and it's really important that you think about what does it mean. Now think about that. That's a significantly small period of time that college exists. But to be poor for your whole life, that difference. That missing the basic necessities of food, shelter, and income, even as a college student, I may have been missing income, but I had food and shelter. But relative poverty are falling behind the average. And that is a big concern when we start looking at social stratification. So what's the definition of poverty? In the United States, they define it through a poverty threshold. And it's 3 times the cost of food, basically, that puts us in that. And we have poverty guidelines placed into effect that allow students to receive support such as Head Start and National School Lunch Program and HEAP, Low Energy Assistance Programs, or LIHEAP, depending on what your state is calling it at that particular time. Interesting, when we look at those poverty guidelines, and we look at a town or an area like Mansfield, more than 50% of our student population qualifies for eligibility for a federal program such as free or assisted lunches. So here's the breakdown. I don't even have to go to the federal site because our book is current and up to date. And so for a family of 3, poverty threshold is $18,222. A family of 4, $24,000. So what can you do with that? Those federal guidelines, that poverty threshold. Well, it's interesting. As we look at guidelines, when we look at family units, you can see that 24,000 there. In the continuous states is 23,850. And then we see Alaska and Hawaii at higher numbers. That is much more expensive to live there. But those are the federal guidelines. So who are the poor? They're more likely to be racial or ethnic minorities. In other words, we know that the African American population, Black population, are more likely to be in this category, Hispanics. Now the exception here is Asians. Asians tend to have higher incomes, but there's still a status of Asians that fall into there. And then we look at the Native American, who are very likely to be poor. Children are more likely to be in the poor that we see in this situation, and we see the diversity, and we start talking about these social problem issues. Families headed by single mothers, people who live in certain geographic areas such as the South, and so that we see that the population itself, and we look at the poverty rates here, we can see the difference of incomes. You see the darkest red is the highest level of income right here in Utah and New Hampshire. And yet, here we go, we fall into these other categories. And Pennsylvania does fairly well, all right? And New York, it varies within that. Now, if we look at the state directly, as we can easily do by looking at each county and where they're at, which I'll ask you to kind of explore on your own, you will see that as we look at the northern tier of Pennsylvania, we fall much closer to some of those New York standards as far as people in poverty by state. Okay. Let me again look at this chart as you see here, and you see the numbers, those high numbers that go across that. So let's look at the perspectives that come into place. The functionalist assume that everyone in the society can or should be equal, that there should be a division and that there is a sense of power, and that those that are in power are rewarded for their behavior, that their value is placed on their talent and their work, and that social institutions, especially education, sort everyone into their proper place, that the society works in such a way to look at the status that inequality is part of the process and part of the work of society. Now, as we look at this, we see that society and this issue, as far as from a functionalist perspective, argue that poverty exists because it's functional for society, that we set social boundaries, it provides those that do less labor into doing the dirty work that needs to be done by society, and that social welfare systems are part of the dysfunction itself and create this welfare bureaucracy. It's interesting as we look at that and we notice how many people stay on welfare for their life, which is less than 4% of the population who gets it. Interesting as we look at that the functionalists are criticized for their value judgments of where people fit. Now, conflict theory looks at this inequality, this division of labor here, as being forced on, remember, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, that Marx saw social classes solely determined by one's economic status, where they fit in the system, whether they're an owner or a worker, and how they fit into place. And so there was a number of looks at this. Now, this is the first time we've brought up Max Weber. Weber is an early sociologist as well, who comes into place, and he really saw that there were multiple dimensions that come into to look at wealth and power in society, and that there are factors as far as income and wealth and the prestige and power that go along with it, which are pretty powerful as we start to explore the issues of where you stand. So if you're poor, you have less power. If you move up into that middle class area, you gain power. You gain that social respect in the capitalist system. Now, C. Wright Mills argued that the United States is ruled by the power elite. And so when we look at that division of money and we look at that top fifth getting more than 51% of the income, we can also look at that 1%, that power elite who controls that 50% of the income. And you'll see that in the videos that you'll be watching for this particular module. Conflict theory really explores the fact that there is this inequality that exists that determines our future. Now, feminist theories looks at this as well, and even though I told you we won't do a lot, we can see that feminist race and gender, if we go back to that very first chart, fall right into place, don't they? That there's a significant difference in the status of men and women and even how they perform in society. The interactionist perspective draws our attention to the social class differences, how they communicate differently through symbols, what's important, and how these symbols produce the social inequality that comes into place, as well as the structure within it. So poverty, The culture of poverty is out there. It sets norms and values, and that encourage and perpetuate poverty. Some say that the poor socialize differently and pass on values. When we study even grandparents, working class grandparents versus middle class grandparents, we find that they grandparent differently. We find that parents will focus on getting the action done in the lower class, and in the middle class, they'll focus more on critical thinking and thinking things out as they work with shouldered as they do their assignments. They'll find them help to get by. They'll look towards changing. So, pretty interesting as we explore these perspectives. They're important for us to look at, to examine the question at a deeper level. Remember, functionalist is a macro and conflict is a macro theory, and then the micro theory that looks at those norms and the culture of poverty. So, what's this all got to do with social problems? Well, the sociology of poverty is a pretty strong piece. Note that these perceptions focus on the role of the individual factors in determining our poverty, right? And our sociological imagination, we begin to look at the social institutions and how they create poverty. So what's the consequences of poverty? Limited access to health care. Most working poor are not eligible for government programs. Now, we're currently on the new Affordable Care Act, right? Affordable Care Act, ACA, or as people call it, Obamacare. And so that everyone now has eligibility for healthcare programs. So this changes it a little. And we now have the lowest number of people without health insurance in the United States, with less than 10% not having health insurance. But there's still a high cost, and the difference in the type of healthcare. Remember, our healthcare is not a national healthcare system. It's still a private controlled system. You can only afford certain levels of cares. Roughly, most states, roughly half the parents with families that left welfare, more than 1/3 of those children lose their Medicare coverage. Okay, so that there has to be some coverage out there. And it's a significant difference on how much help they receive. We'll examine that more in the healthcare chapter. Food insecurity. When families don't have access to enough food for healthy and active lives, it affects the family for the rest of their lives. And so we see poorer households experience higher food prices than the national average because of where they live. Now, think about this. In the middle of the city in an unsafe area, and there aren't grocery stores available, or those that are have to pay higher rents and have more problems keeping food in place, and their costs are much higher. But also those in rural areas where they have to drive 50 miles to get to a grocery store of any size, and therefore their food prices. We have this higher level of food insecurity and hunger. We have the lack of affordable housing and what is available within that, as we can well attest to things like that within our own community. How do you afford the housing when the housing rates went up so high, when the glass dwellers were in place and those rents have not dropped? And so we still have a level of unemployment. In 40 states, workers need to earn more than 2 times the minimum wage just to afford housing. Pretty strong. U.S. welfare policies, they've changed a lot, but they started in 1935 with the Social Security Act, and by 1950s we were looking at the in place of the war on poverty. We were looking at supporting people with disabilities and other families that were in place. By the 1960s, we start the war on poverty. At that point, at the Kennedy administration, 25% of the United States is considered in poverty, and we developed these social programs to help and give opportunities such as Head Start and Upward Bound and Youth Corps coming into place as we implemented trying to eliminate poverty. by the way, those poverty statistics continued to drop, though the war on poverty wasn't all that successful. And then with the economic downturn that we've recently gone through in the early 2000s, the poverty level for children has gone back up to about 25%. And so welfare's changed over time. We've gone from ADC to TANF, and TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, only covers families. And what we've found is the new program, there are time limits that come into place of how long people can be in the system and where they are at the system, because we looked for this long-term welfare population that wasn't necessarily there. And so that we have over 20 states have chosen to impose these shorter time limits, put into effect some real issues as they explore this economy. Obviously, your chapter gives you this in much more depth, but we start looking at redefining this poverty line and exploring it, because we're still basing things on statistics from the 1960s and 70s as we look at what determines what is poverty. Does it make a difference? Yeah, it makes a difference as we start exploring what goes into place. So what does it mean to be poor? If the misery of the poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institution, it is the greatest sin, said Charles Darwin. And you can see how many times our poverty issues are definitely those things that we have brought into place. So let me return to our module and ask you to move forward in exploring your module here for the week. I'm asking you to watch a movie called The 51st State, Americans Working Poor, again, available through the library. If you cannot log through the link here, go to the library, enter videos, then Films on Demand, and put in the search for the American Working Poor. Do not forget that you have to sign in if you are not on campus to view this. And then there's two quick YouTube videos, both very short, that I want you to think about, and then link yourself into the discussion board for the week. As you do that, you're going to see that you're brought into your question. What do you think can be done to resolve poverty? So you're going to put together some thoughts of what you've created in your mind after reviewing the chapter and this information. Have a great week. I look forward to your comments.